Hi everyone, Andy here at MVP Java. Today we're going to be taking a look at Spring Boot. So what problem does Spring Boot solve? Well, if you're anything like me, the first thing you do when you start a Spring application project is you go out and you look for your dependencies, right? And so if you're working with transactions, you go look how to register Spring Bean, also transaction manager. And then you go taking a look, let's say, at Spring MVC. You say, well, I need Spring MVC. Let me go get the dependencies for that. You put them in your POM. And then you say, well, I got to know how to register a Spring Bean of type, let's say, dispatcher servlet. And the list goes on and on and on. More functionality you need, more dependencies you need to go get, and then you need to register your Spring Beans. And they all have to play nicely with each other, right? So you got to worry about the versions at the end of the day. So there's a lot of boilerplate configuration that goes into setting up a Spring application. And this is even before you start coding your business logic, right? So that's the whole point of Spring Boot, is to eliminate the pain of the startup dependencies and to also provide auto configuration by automatically registering the Spring Beans that you would have had to do after you would have gone to get those dependencies. So right off the bat, you're served with a working project that you can then tailor and override the defaults and concentrate on your business logic. So that's a very big deal because Spring is such a mature technology today. It's been about 10 years, or if not 10 years already, that Spring's been around. So there's a lot of technology stacks out there. And so a lot of dependencies and a lot of registration of Spring Bean even before you get to the point where you're coding what you really want to code. So Spring Boot wraps all that up, says, hey, don't worry about all those dependencies. Just tell me what kind of functionality you need in your application. I'll handle all the startup dependencies. And I'll talk about auto configuration in a minute on how it actually automatically registers your beans for you. So it's a big deal, okay? A lot of people are using Spring Boot today, and it really alleviates that issue of boilerplate configuration, and we can get up and started much, much quicker than we used to. So if you want to use Spring Boot, you're going to have to go through the Spring Initializer. Now, there's two ways to do that. You can go, officially to the website and do that, or you can go through a command line interface tool that I'll show you at the end of the tutorial here. Okay, whatever you like best, you can use. So if we go here to the Spring Initializer web page, okay, you can see here. I'm just going to say switch to full mode. Okay, you can see here that it's been tailored for Maven right now by default. There's the Spring Boot version. And you got your usual suspects here for Maven in terms of the group, the artifact, the name, and all that. I'm going to leave that as is for now. We'll change that later on. You can see here that you can play around with the packaging. I'm going to ask for a WAR file version of Java. We'll keep it to the latest. And obviously, we'll be using Java. Now here, this is really cool because you're not looking for dependencies. You're basically saying what kind of functionality you want in your application, which is a huge deal. It's kind of like going to the restaurant and saying, I want to eat a sandwich. A ham sandwich. You're not going to start, describing all the ingredients that go into making the bread and all the rest of the stuff, right? So we're just basically dining a la carte over here, right? We're just saying what we want. So think of this as a menu of functionality. So I want web functionality. So this is basically Spring MVC. And if you take a look at the description here, it's going to embed a Tomcat server for us, which is great. And okay, go down here. There's a lot of stuff here, okay? I'm not going to be clicking all over the place. I just want to concentrate on Spring Boot in this tutorial, but we'll click on a couple of these. Over here, I'm going to be using JPA, and underneath the covers, if you take a look at the description, it's going to be using Hibernate, which is fine with me. I'm going to be using an embedded data source in H2. And for a template engine, so my view, I'm going to use Thymeleaf over here, okay? Something that I'm a little bit familiar with. If we go down, you can see there's really an amazing list of functionality that you can just click and ask for. And again, anything you click for, all the dependencies will be automatically downloaded for you, and they'll play all nicely with each other. So you don't have to worry about all these versioning issues that might crop up later on. Now, I'm going to stop. I'm not going to click on anything else really. The Actuator, I'm going to show you later on how we can just add the configuration after the whole thing's been built. It's really not hard at all. It's business as usual. Here you just say generate project. It's going to by default now generate a demo.zip because I didn't name it anything else. So what's going to happen now is you're going to go there, you're going to unzip that, and you're going to put it in a location that you'd want to import in your application in your IDE rather. Okay, so that's what I've done here. Put it up here, demo, and out of the box you get all this stuff. Okay, let's take a look at all that stuff. All right, nothing in there, nothing in there. Okay, so first off, what's the most interesting thing in terms of for looking at startup dependencies is the pom.xml file, right? If we go take a look at our dependencies, you can see here that everything that starts with starter or has starter in it is what we clicked on in the web initializer, okay? So I clicked on JPA, I clicked on Thymeleaf, I clicked on web. So what this does is it downloads all the necessary dependencies for you, and you'll notice that the version is not even there. That's because we're getting the versions from the parent POM file that's being downloaded from the repository online from Spring, okay? And its versions, let's say of Hibernate or of Spring MVC, etc., they're all tied to the Spring Boot version that we selected in the Spring Initializer webpage. So you don't have to worry about all of this. This has all been tested to work nicely together, all right? Now, the other thing, there's my database too, my embedded database. The other thing that they added that we did not click on is the Spring Boot Starter Test. So that's basically Spring Test, okay? So that's great. It's going to download the dependencies like JUnit. It's going to give you Hamcrest. It's going to give you Makito. So lots of stuff there. And again, if you don't like those dependencies or those transitive dependencies, you can just exclude them in the POM file as you would normally in any Maven project and download your own, and it'll just take it. Okay, so you can always override the configuration from Spring Boot. It'll just get out of the way, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. There's also a specific plugin here for specific goals that they have. Okay, so we'll come back to the POM file in a second. Well, maybe not in a second, but soon. So if we take a look at the classes that have been generated for us, this is the main class here, which has been annotated with Spring Boot application. Now that's a big annotation. That's like an annotation on steroids, I call it that, all right? This annotation is actually worth 3 other annotations. It's an @configuration annotation. So this class is actually not only your bootstrap class, but it's your first and only right now configuration class. So Java config class, right? So you can come in here and specify any @bean that you want, and Spring Boot will take it into consideration over perhaps what it has automatically configured for you, right? If they're of the same type. It's also an @component scan. So best practice is not to actually define your extra beans in here. If and when you do that, those would be in other classes that you would annotate with @configuration, and this would just pick it up because it's an @component scan. And the last thing is the @enable autoconfig. So the @enable autoconfig is really what the second point here that I want to talk about, right? The auto configuration. So what happens is the starter dependencies get onto the class path, and then Spring Boot says, well, based on what's on the class path, I will automatically configure those as Spring Beans, okay? Because you asked for those starter dependencies. Now, what happens if you're not happy with those with those Spring Beans is you can always override them, and I'll show you very soon when we get to this demo here, Spring Boot tutorial, how that's actually done, how you can actually override that configuration, okay? So all in all, this class is dual purpose. It's your boot class, okay? And it's also your primary Java config class. Now, here you'll notice a class called Spring Application. That's how Spring Boot loads its application context, okay? So you pass in the main class and any of the arguments. There's a couple of interfaces you could actually implement in this class actually to go a little bit further. But we'll keep it this simple for the first tutorial, okay? Because we're not going to be defining any other Spring Beans in this class right now. So know that Spring Boot always uses Spring Application to load the context. We're going to be revisiting that class in a couple of minutes, and know that this is basically the magic that happens for Spring Boot. It's really of those other 3 annotations that I just talked about. Okay. Servlet Initializer. Servlet Initializer is really replacing your web.xml file because we asked for a WAR file, we asked for a web application. You don't see any web.xml file in this hierarchy here that I've expanded, right? And that's all thanks to the Spring Boot Servlet Initializer, which is really just an implementation of the web application initializer. So for any of you who have done any Java config already and have already implemented or used the web application initializer interface, this one is actually implementing it, and it's called an opinionated implementation, which means that it's loading the application context via this method here, configure. You'll notice it's using our main class, or bootstrap class that I just talked about, right? That serves as our application context. So it's always going to have to go through this class here, right? Spring application. So when I say it's an opinionated implementation, it means that it's going through the Spring application class to boot or to load the application context into your web application context, okay? So we don't have to have a comma separated list of classes with our configuration, because that main class is a component scanner, so we'll pick up all the other ones that you can possibly come up with later on, okay? So we also have tests, integration tests already lined up and ready for us to use, okay? So these are the usual suspects in Spring Test. I'm not gonna go over those because this is not that type of tutorial. I'm just gonna concentrate on Spring Boot. What's really particular to Spring Boot here is the Spring application configuration. This is exactly the same thing as you have in a normal integration test, primarily the @context configuration annotation. The only difference is because we're in a Spring Boot environment, and the application context is loaded differently in this case. Again, it's loaded to the Spring application. What happens is this annotation is Spring Boot aware, and it knows when it goes to load the application context, right? That annotation says how to load it. It goes to the main class, and it'll go through the Spring application class to load it. Okay, so that's all that really is. And this is not really particular to Spring Boot, but I'll just mention it here, just in case you've never seen it. That specifies to the context loader that you want a web application context to load into the test context framework, so that you can, let's say, use mock MVC later on to implement that, to auto-wire the web context in there. Okay, so last but not least, you've got the resources here. Nothing's been set up for us in our application properties, is empty. But the really cool thing, okay, is I could just run this, right? And I'll say, yeah, click that, use that class. And it's going to load for you. You can see here the little Spring logo. It'll automatically load for you the Tomcat server, already, it's embedded, by the way, okay, already ready. And if I actually go here, it's already been binded to localhost 8080. Now, obviously we haven't done anything extra to override any error mappings or a home page or anything like that. So just getting this is already a huge deal. This is a white label error page. Your embedded Tomcat server is up and running. It's using a data source that's pulled from within Tomcat. So everything has already been set up. You haven't had to register a thing yet, and you already have something that's functional. Okay, so now obviously we're going to go in there and we're going to start, adding our things that we want in there. So what I've done is I've taken this demo application and I've copied it over to Spring Boot tutorial, and I've added some more interesting things. So first on the list here is I've added an entity. So an entity here, don't forget, we said we want a JPA, and underneath the covers it's Hibernate. So I'm going to use the standard JPA annotations here to map this airport class to its table. Make it an entity, there's an ID, nothing special here. We've got an ID, a 3-letter ICAO code identifying the airport, the city, and the country. Keeping it simple, right? Just concentrating on Spring Boot. We have an MVC controller here. So the MVC controller, @controller, I basically have the servlet context maps to /airports, and I am dependency injecting via Spring a repository. Remember I said I want a JPA or Spring data, right? And put that in there, and I'm basically saying here, whenever we're going to request /list off the servlet mapping, that I'm going to find all of them and just pump them back in to the model, and then I'll return it to a list or an airport list, which is mapped to a view. Now again, I didn't have to register a view resolver. I didn't have to register dispatcher servlet or anything like that. All of this has been done. So by default, it's going to map a view resolver that takes this airport list string here, and it's going to map it to the logical name that it's going to find that I've come up with in my template. So my template here, I have a Thymeleaf template because I selected it, remember, from the list. And I'm just going to get from the model and going to display the ID, ICAO code, city, and country. Again, this kind of stuff, very simple, right? Doesn't need any introduction in Spring Boot. We're just going to have this displayed as is on that template when we run it. Now, if we actually look at the repo, I use the default Spring data repo extension. So JPA repository specifying my entity and my primary key long. Okay. Now I didn't come up with any customized methods here because I don't want to concentrate on that. I just want to show you that at runtime we have the dynamic proxies that come and actually implement this class, and we can just use it. Okay, implement this interface rather and just use it. So that class will be done for us. Nothing's different in the serverless initializer. It's business as usual. I haven't touched anything. Main, same thing, business as usual. All I've done is come up with basically a DAO, a repository, a controller, an entity, and a view. That's all I've done. Okay. So if I run this now, let's see what happens. It's probably going to do the same thing, and it has. Okay. So let's go take a look at our embedded Tomcat server. Okay, let's go to the mapping that I came up with, airports list, and there it is. Okay, so we've got 3 airports that I've set up here, the ICAO code, the city, and the country. Now you may be asking yourself, where did this data come from? Right? Well, I haven't shown that to you for sure. I'm going to do that right now. Okay, so what I've done is I've said, well, I'm going to override the configuration. And that's really what I wanted to show you at this point here, right? So how do I override or add configuration to Spring Boot? I decided to override the configuration by specifying my own data source. Okay, so where did I do that? I did that in this package over here, database config. Now, it's an add configuration class, so it's a Java config class. Now, it's going to get picked up automatically by Spring Boot because, don't forget, my steroid annotation that I was talking about before, right? It's going to automatically pick this up because it is a component scan as well. So over here, you'll notice that the type is data source, and that I'm basically doing business as usual here when it comes to Java config and describing your own data source. I got my embedded data source type H2, my name, and here I'm specifying the scripts that are going to set up the schema and then populate the schema. And it's a builder, right? So then you got to call build. So you'll notice that they're here, these scripts. Okay, so I got my schema that just drops the table and creates it after every application restart. And I got the data that I'm pumping in there. So really nothing magical happening in there. So how does Spring Boot know to go use my bean instead of the bean that it had defined of type data source, which, like I said, was a pooled data source from Tomcat, right? Well, since Java or Spring 4.0, they introduced conditional configuration, and that really is the basis of Spring Boot once those startup dependencies have been downloaded for you. If you take a look at the dependencies here that have all been downloaded for us, there's a whack load of them and all the transitive dependencies that you don't have to worry about too. There's one of great interest here, Spring Boot Auto Configure. Okay, if you take a look at that, so that has to do with auto configuration, there'll be a package in there called condition. And in there, there's a whole bunch of classes mostly implementing the conditional interface, okay, which I said again is something that came new in Spring 4.0. And there's one in there called conditional on missing bean. What this does is saying, if the bean in the application configuration, right, this is in my application configuration right here, if that's missing, then I will register one for you that is found on the class path. Well, in this case, it is not missing. It is present because I configured it in the application context. So in that case, the auto configurer in Spring Boot will use this one, the one I have configured, instead of the one that's on the class path. Okay, so this kind of stuff you don't have to worry about. It's taken care of for you, but it's fun to know how it works. Okay, so you can always override whatever bean type you see fit inside the Spring application, and Spring Boot will get out of the way and use yours. Okay. Now here's the thing. I can actually take this and comment it, and let's say if I run this, see what happens. Now usually you would say, well, it's gonna go back to the pool data source, right? Well, that's right, but if that was the case, it wouldn't be using my data, right? In this case here, if I refresh this, it's still using my data. So what happened? How is this possible? Well, it ends up that, you know, your first reflex to actually come in here when you want to override something from Spring Boot and do what I just showed you is actually probably not the best first reflex to have, okay? What you should be doing is going to the resources file, right? So the application.properties, and you'll notice in here that I've used the data source URL there by using an embedded the H2 database directly instead of the one from Tomcat, the pooled one. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a whack load of properties out there, okay, and that you can just use them to override the configuration without having to actually write code, okay? Now there's going to be exceptions to that for sure. For example, Spring Security is a big one, okay, that comes to mind. Now, I'm also going to have to specify this property here. And the reason for that is because I'm using Hibernate under JPA, it's automatically going to use the mappings inside the entity to create the schema for me. And I don't want that. I want my scripts to come into play and create the schema and populate it. So I have to set this to none actually, because by default it's create-drop, okay? So once you set that, there's a convention over configuration that takes place that looks at off the resources the directory here, if there's a schema.sql and a data.sql, and it'll execute them in that order, schema first and data second. So by using that convention over configuration, I don't have to say add scripts like I was doing before. So these are the two properties that I need. And again, if you want to know which ones to override, go look at the Spring Boot documentation. There's pages and pages and pages of them. And you find which one you want based on the functionality to override whatever you want. Now, these ones I just put here because I wanted to enable the console for H2 to kind of look at what was going on in there. Don't have to look at that. And here I'm going to show you how to use something called the Actuator. Okay, so the Actuator, if we go take a look at our outline, this is, I want to show you an example of just adding configuration after the fact, right? So the pom.xml file that I showed you beforehand, if we go take a look at that, I added something in here. This is the same thing as the demo one. I actually added the actuator here. So it's very simple to know, what kind of other dependencies you want. You just come in here and you use the ID to help you out. I said actuator. And what's going to happen is it downloads all those starter dependencies for you, registers the Spring Beans at runtime, okay, or at startup time. That's when the auto configure kicks in, right, is at startup time. All those startup dependencies, that's at build time. So once I get the actuator, I can use it. So the question you should be asking is, what the heck's an actuator? An actuator is there. It's a functionality that you can add to your Spring Boot application to see what's going on underneath the covers, okay? So for example, if you wanted to know what kind of metrics were going on in your application, for example, how many people were hitting this kind of link, a certain type of link, or a certain kind of mapping, or if you wanted to know your environment variables, or if you wanted to know the health status of your application, or if you wanted to know the bean configuration of your application, all these kind of things you can do with an actuator. What they do is they publish, or they have published, public RESTful endpoints that you have access to, okay? So if we go back to the browser, actually it's still loaded, yes, I can use the browser, and you come here, I've put some bookmarks here. For example, /health is a well-known endpoint for Actuator, okay? You can see the status of my application is up, you have some stats on the disk space, your database is up, the type of database, it's already been pulled. So this is just the default out of the box, all right? So you can add whatever you want in terms of a health status here. The other thing is, kind of cool, you can look at your bean configuration. So if you want to take a look, let's say at your airport controller, it'll tell you the scope of it, it's a singleton, right? It'll tell you the fully qualified name, where the resource lies, and the dependencies. This is really what you'd probably want to look at. So the dependencies right here only have one, or else it'd be a comma separated list like an array. And here I'm saying the repository, the airport list repo, is being dependency injected into the constructor. So obviously, a very useful tool. There's a lot of endpoints that are published. I'm not going to cover Actuator. Okay, I just want to show you how you can easily just go into your application and after the fact of creating a Spring Boot application, go into the pom.xml file and just add extra starter dependencies. It's just like working in a regular pom.xml file. There's really no different. Okay, it's that magic of pulling them in and auto-configuring the beans that is really an asset when using Spring Boot. All right. So last thing on the list that I wanted to cover. Okay. And if we take a look at the outline, I wanted to cover the command line interface. So there is another way of actually going to do this, right? If you go take a look at this link over here, all right, Spring Boot CLI, you can actually go download the spring.bat file if you're using Windows right here. I clicked on 135 and I went to go get the zip file. Once you get that zip file, right, unpack it wherever you want. I've actually unpacked it. Let's go take a look where here. I got my DOS prompt right over here. I've unpacked it here, Spring Boot 135. What you got to do is you got to take the bin directory, right, and you add it to your environmental path. So once you've got that done, you can use these commands. So if you take a look at what's in here, I got my spring.bat. Now, there is a Spring shell, okay? So you can actually go in here and say Spring, right, to get some help there, that's fine. And you can say Spring shell. Once you go into the Spring shell, you can get some really cool features like autocomplete and so forth. So what I want to do now is do the exact same thing we did before, but just through the command line. So you can actually use the init command now. Now that you're in the Spring shell, you don't have to prepend every command with Spring. So it's really, really easy. You can say init, and then you say, well, -d for dependencies. You can say the whole word or -d. And then in here, I'm going to say I want, what did we say? We wanted web, right? And we wanted data or JPA data. Well, Spring data JPA will be the same. I'm not going to specify Thymeleaf or anything like that. I'll just keep it like this, right? I want to package this up as a WAR file, and I want everything to get unzipped to an example directory or a project called demo. Whoops, excuse me, demo. Okay, so do this. You'll notice that it's still going through the spring.io, the Spring Initializer website. It's just a different interface. The whole thing works the same. Okay, you'll notice now, oh, I'm in the shell, so I can't use regular DOS commands here. So I'll just exit here to show you that it got created. You'll see that the demo is there. Now that I'm out of the shell, I can run this, but I got to prepend it with Spring. So I'll say Spring run demo. And it should show me the Spring logo, and it's going to do the exact same thing as I showed you on the first example, okay, with the white page, the error page. So if I go here and I go back to my localhost 8080, boom, same deal, okay? So there you have it, guys. Spring Boot in a nutshell. You've seen it through the web page, the Spring Initializer web page. You've seen it through the command line interface. If you want to know what next tutorial I'm going to come up with, you can always check out my Facebook, my Google Plus, or my Twitter page. And I'll always let you guys know probably about a week after I pull out a tutorial what the next one's going to be. But I can tell you in advance here, the next one's also going to be on Spring. So I'm going to continue kind of a Spring series from now on. That's it for me, guys. Hope you enjoyed that. And until next time, ciao.